We're going to talk about design patterns and hyperlinking in biblical narrative. In many ways, this represents the thing that I'm most excited about current real time. This is October 2019. For those of you watching the class online, you're in the future. What's it like? What's it like there? But real time, this has been the past few years of investment in research and study for me with a group of colleagues that I've learned a lot from as well. And so I'll be bringing up some of their work and their names as well as other scholars. But two analogies, two metaphors to set before us that have been very helpful for me. The first metaphor or analogy would be the kind of image that sits in front of us with the photo mosaic. You've seen these types of photos before? Mm-hmm. They're mosaic photos made up of hundreds or thousands of tiny little photographs. I discovered this when you Google the word photo mosaic. Somewhere on the first or second page will be the website of a guy named Robert Silvers, who claims to have invented the photo mosaic. Oh. In fact, he's even trademarked the word. So, anyway, he's got a cool website. He's a photographer, and so he talks about how he came up with it, and whatever. This is his claim. I haven't tried to confirm or deny it.
Best to avoid a lawsuit anyway, I guess.
That's right. So what's cool is that he talks about how, he put them together, and then he has lots of samples from throughout his decades of work. He has one whole section that's just portraits of famous historical characters. I have a strong interest in the history of early jazz, and Louis Armstrong, come on. Trumpet player, anybody?
Yeah.
Master, sage master. So this is his photo mosaic portrait of Louis Armstrong. It's made up of hundreds of photos taken from recording sessions with Louis Armstrong and his crew over the years. So there's even right there a photo of someone made up of photos of the thing that they were doing for the whole of their career. Just that right there communicates something. So notice the technique that's involved here. Is the image on the left, is it a unified portrait of Louis Armstrong? Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. You can see him. What your mind is doing is that thing that Adele Berlin was talking about, that your mind is actually creating order and filling in detail of the shape of a cheek, right? Or the shape of an upper lip. Even though if you zoom in close, it's itself a complex little photo. These are such cool illustrations. So in many ways, this has been a very helpful and illuminating analogy for how the Hebrew Bible works. It's somewhat similar to the quilt analogy. For me, what's helpful in this is to think about the technique involved in creating patterns of meaning on a macro level using little building blocks that are themselves little detailed portraits with their own little pattern of meaning in them. So what he needed to create this contrast between Louis' forehead and the background is images that are mostly cast with the dark black background and a lone lit figure. And so those are grouped together. And so you could say that's it's a pattern of light in composition. These have been grouped together because of their similarity. And then your mind creates one whole thing out of a mosaic composite whole. This is how the Hebrew Bible works. Back to our discussion earlier, the story of Jonah. When Jesus mentions the story of Jonah, he's activating one little photo that is itself a part of a whole network of very similarly shaped photos. And when Jesus and the apostles the people who wrote the scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they do this all the time. They'll use one moment from the Hebrew Bible to activate a hyperlinked pattern. And what they assume is, Jonah and, and there you go. There's nothing for it. This is how the Hebrew Bible works. So this last skill that I want us to focus on then is how do I get this? How do I read this way or learn how to read this way? What are the tools that the biblical authors are employing to network and pattern and group different stories and poems and so on? So that's one image. Second analogy to get this reading skill set on the table would be the way that a film that is hours and hours long creates cohesion in the plot line. So let's think of, when it comes to Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings, people have very strong opinions. So I'm just using the films based on the fact that a lot of people have seen the films, probably more people that have read the books. So we have a large, complex narrative world spanning many places, many characters. However, do you experience the whole epic story as a unified plot line with the core? Of course you do. How and why? Well, what is the main thing that threads all of the different characters and episodes together? Just like Aslan in the Narnia, it's the ring. There's this ring, the ring of divine power that has wreaked terrible havoc, right, in the world, and the ring has to be dealt with. It must be destroyed. And so, however, the ring has powers that will corrupt and destroy you. And so one of the most repeated motifs in the film is people having their ring temptation moment as they encounter the ring. And so, I have here, this actually is not in the order of the film, but it's in the order kind of the characters' chronology. You have Smeagol on the upper left, who is consumed and destroyed by the ring. And ironically, the one who is first consumed and destroyed by the ring will be the one to destroy it at the very end, but while destroying himself at the same time. It's as if the arc of Smeagol, who becomes Gollum, his narrative, an encounter with the ring, becomes a paradigm for what could happen to the whole narrative world if it gets into the wrong hands.
You should have said spoiler alert.
I'm so sorry.
It's an old book.
Yeah, it's the old book.
I know. I'm terrible. I've only seen the first two.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. I'm so
Slash
sorry.
spoiler alert for all of them.
Okay, yes. Well,
That's one of the
I don't
strong
know.
opinions.
There we
like
go.
a 3-year rule on stuff.
all of those.
You're right. Okay,
I was
so you guys
just
with me? Here, all right. No, it's okay. Does every character repeat Smeagol's fate in the story? No. There's a diversity of responses to the temptation of the ring. Bilbo, for example, is he harmed by the ring's tempting powers? Yeah. It wrecks. Do you remember? It wrecks him as a character. He's never the same. He's a little more isolated and doesn't feel at home in his home anymore after he's been using the ring. But is he ultimately able to part with it so that it can be? Yes, yeah. So similar motif. So think back to biblical poetry, parallel lines. Similar, but different. And it's the similarity that makes you compare these characters, but it's the difference that begins to create meaning of the ethical and moral worldview of the story. When Gandalf is offered the ring, he resists. But it's the first time in the story you see him go into fetal position, and he's just barely able to resist. He becomes terrified and afraid because he knows the potential that it would have to ruin him and everyone around him. You have this arrogant human king who gives in to the ring, and then it's taken from him at the moment, and in the next scene leads to his death. So this is a good example of the strategy of, instead of the narrator, coming in saying, now, we all know that was a bad thing to do. You watch a character try and get the ring, and then he dies in the next scene.
Right.
It's very clear what the storyteller's trying to do. When Galadriel is offered the ring, she freaks out but not in a different way than Gandalf. She begins to imagine the terrifying queen of death and evil that she would become, and she lights up like a Christmas tree. And then she fades out and is a little terrified and says no. Wow. There's only one character who brushes off the ring like it's no problem, and it's the one who will become king, right? Aragorn. And of course,
It's a good story. The way I'm interested.
yes, totally. All right, now think about this. This is a wonderful inversion strategy. Frodo, who is the other arguable main character alongside the ring, he's entrusted with it to destroy it. Sorry, Mackenzie. And he's also very similar in frame and appearance as Smeagol, who the ring does destroy. And actually, he becomes more and more burdened by the ring. And when it comes to the moment to destroy it, he decides that he's going to keep it for himself. He's overtaken with it, just like Smeagol. And it's actually Smeagol's mutant self then steals it and accidentally destroys it. And so Frodo becomes an inverted Gollum. He was going to give in to it, but he's rescued not even by his own willpower, but by the evil of another character.
It's as though the evil collapsed on itself.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's as if the ring, through its own evil scheming,
Right.
fell into its own. It's kind of like that proverb: somebody digs a pit for another,
Yeah.
he will fall into it.
Yeah.
Here we go. Okay, so look what's happening. Okay, now look. So Peter Jackson, the director of the film, he sees this very clear motif in the novels, or in the books, and so he's composed all of these scenes to hyperlink to each other. When you stop and look at them, it's a zoom shot, often with some kind of vertical angle, looking up, looking down, and it's of the person you can just look at it visually. Gandalf and Galadriel's, the two great wizards, or wizardesses, the female of wizardess? Wizardess.
Wizardess.
To wizards? I don't know.
She's a wizard.
She's a she's.
So Gandalf and Galadriel both have moments that. So think they're hyperlinked. Back to the Louis Armstrong. Even though they're distant in the movie, your mind creates a pattern of connection. This is just like how Psalm 29 worked on us yesterday. Do you see that? So this is what I meant by, and why we talked about poetry first. And I think it has to do with the fact that poetry is the oldest medium of storytelling in ancient Near Eastern cultures. And remember, we looked at those little clues that the oldest form of Israelite narrative was in these ancient poems. So it makes perfect sense that as the tradition developed into prose narrative, it's still the poetic instincts that guide the design and communication strategies. In other words, parallelism and matching through repetition in poetry, it's still happening in prose narrative, just in a different literary form, which means we need to build out the skill set of what it takes to recognize it. So these two analogies, the longer I've lived with them, have become immensely helpful to me. The Hebrew Bible is a composite unity and that unity is created by similar stories and poems connected to each other through repetition and similarity, but also difference. So here you can do it visually in both of these analogies. But of course, the Bible isn't a picture book, at least the Hebrew Bible. What is it made up of? Words. It's made up of words. So however the authors are going to create this cohesion and hyperlinked unity, it's going to be through verbal linkage and repetition, the repetition of words. And so we're back to where we were. The repetition of words and slight variation. It's the most fundamental skill to develop in reading biblical literature, is learning to track repetition. And it's pretty intuitive. If I have a main point, I'm going to say it a lot. But hopefully, to say that thing a lot, I'm not going to just identically repeat the thing I'm going to say a lot. I'm going to do little slight differences so that the thing I say a lot will be the thing that you get the main idea from, but I don't want to bore you, so I say it a lot so that you get the idea. That was stupid, I'm sorry. So what this means, 2 skills required. One is to learn how to identify quilt pieces, how to identify the individual little units of the photomosaic, while simultaneously seeing how they connect together into meaningful patterns. So we're going to dive into each one kind of individually. The first one is actually fairly intuitive, which is learning how to identify the pieces of the photomosaic. So let's focus on that for the moment. Should we transition?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. One way to think about that skill set is identifying literary units. If I'm working with narratives are made up of pieces and parts. And think of a TV show, episodes. You have a whole episode made up of different scenes. And those scenes usually take place in one setting or with a group of characters, and then they walk into the next room, new scene. So just think of that basic concept. Think of plots. Every macro, the Abraham story is made up of multiple episodes, but each episode might have little scenes made up of them. So let me just show you as an example. Here is the Eden narrative, broken down from its biggest unit to the smallest units. Biggest units on the right, smallest units on the left. So the Eden narrative begins when God takes a wilderness and makes a garden called Eden. The Eden narrative ends when the humans are expelled from Eden at the end of chapter 3, and the narrative moves on to a new setting. So on the macro level, you've got Genesis 2:4 to Genesis 3:24, the Eden. It's like, think of a play or a film. That's where everything's happening on the Eden set. Let's move in a level. The Eden narrative begins with, and there was no humans and no farming and no plants to eat. Bummer. How are we going to get a story out of this? So we go from the wilderness to God planting a garden, and with a community of humans who can now fulfill the Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply. That's kind of like the movement of scene 1. You go from wilderness to setting the humans up with a great situation. That would be creating, it would be a little mini plot conflict. No humans and no plants and no farming. How are we going to overcome it? Well, God's the creator, so he just waters the dry land. And that also makes clay, so you can make the human. And then humans alone, so you need to split the atom. and make 2 humans out of 1 human, and boom, there we go, we're ready. Ideal setting, we're set up and ready to rock. Plot conflict. There's a snake. And the snake deceives the woman, and through the woman deceives the man. And God has to come and have a conversation about that. Then we are informed of the sad consequences of their decision, exile from the garden. Do you see how that comes in movements here? Set up, problem caused, consequences of that. Let's move in, even one more level. Here, let's move in to look at the text. And you can actually watch the signals happen in front of you. Genesis 2:4 begins with a little narrative heading. It's like a hinge from Genesis 1 into Genesis 2. The narrative proper begins, now no shrub of the field, no plants, no human, but there was in Hebrew it's an aid, a stream comes up from the ground. Well, where you have water and dirt, you've got clay. Now we can start growing some stuff. So God makes a garden That's verses 4 through 9. Do you see that? We go from wilderness to garden with beautiful trees. Now, a little discourses about some rivers. It's just this long paragraph about these rivers. And you could, okay, I've entered a little, this is a new unit. It's a new little photo mosaic tile here. After that, I've got a human in the garden who's given a command about the tree. New scene. God speaks up. Human alone, problem. Then all through the end of chapter 2 is the resolution of that problem. So do you see our little scenes? It's very intuitive, and you don't even realize that your brain is creating divisions and segments and transitions because it's so seamless. But I found it helps to mentally just start writing it out as you read and imagine a stage or a film set or a camera focus or zoom. You go from, then immediately, scene change. Verse 1, now there's a snake. You're like, okay. Now the characters provide a scene shift. And this whole episode with the snake spans from verse 1 all the way down to verse 13, where God is asking the woman, and she says, it was that snake. So we go from the snake introduced, snake creates a problem, God shows up, the problem was the snake. And it's a little, it's a tortilla wrap. The snake is at the opening and conclusion of that scene. What happens next? God addresses the serpent, he addresses the woman, he addresses the man. The three characters in the previous scene. Then after his speech to them, we have the closing narrative of how God first provides skin for the humans and then expels them from the garden. So if you picture it in your mind, picture a camera and a set, and you will begin intuitively to fill in the literary units and the divisions between them. So I don't know if this is interesting or boring to you. I think it's a fundamental tool. It's not exciting in and of itself. It's actually the discipline of reading the story with a more detailed eye than you would normally. And it's an exercise that will get you starting to notice
It
things.
makes the stories interesting when you actually picture it happening like that, taking the direction. So I think for my own children, saying read this like a movie has been more helpful
Yes.
because that's the medium that they're familiar with.
Yeah, that's right.
And
Yeah.
that
And the techniques are similar.
Right, yeah.
Yep.
very helpful.
Yep. Often what I'll just have a blank notebook in front of me, and I'm doing this. I'm creating these little charts or think of nesting dolls. Of here's the tiniest little scenes, and then they build up, and what are the movements on that level, kind of like we did with the plot embedding. And you watch the photo mosaic emerge. So once you begin to isolate distinct literary units, then the real action is how are they tied together? What are the words that are repeated that link them all together? And here's where the action begins, in my humble opinion. It's through repeated words. Surprise! It's through repetition. So actually, before we dive into repeated words, I'm going to close the session just by naming the tool that will become your best friend as you try to attentively read biblical narratives. It's called a concordance. So there's actually very nuts and bolts, but until someone showed me one and how it works, I didn't know how to use it. So essentially what a concordance is it's a collection of lists of all of the English words that appear in your translation. And then it will give you all of the lists and every time they occur. So love. If you want to do a word study, where do you go? You go to a concordance. It will give you all of the English appearances of the word love. Let's just say in the Hebrew Bible. But of course, the Bible wasn't written in English. So what concordances have to do then is provide some sort of tagging system to help you know which Hebrew words are underneath, because there's a few different words for love in Hebrew. And so which one is being used? Because what I want to do is actually study repetition of Hebrew words, because that's what they're writing in, and that's how they're linking things together in Hebrew. So most of your major Bible translations are going to have their own corresponding concordance. So, for example, if you read the New American Standard, the publishers of the New American Standard are connected to one of the oldest and most well-known concordances called the Strong's Concordance. And this is actually a pretty helpful tool. It's also publicly domain online for free. So it's a free digital concordance. So for a long time, until the last decade, print concordances were, there's the NIV concordance. There are most translations that are main on the market have a concordance. And it may sound boring, but read the introduction. It's like when you go get like a drill from the hardware store, and you're kind of intuitive. I think I know what to do, but it pays to like read the thing and be like, oh, it can do this and it can do that too. And it's a tool. Like think of it as an actual tool. And so research one, get one that matches, the translation you read the introduction, and you will learn how to use it. And all of a sudden, it can become your best friend, because when you want to know what is everything that takes place in Bethlehem in the Bible, it's literally one search away. So you can get print concordances. You can get Bible software. So I'm using the Logos Bible software, or Logos, depending on how you learn how to pronounce Greek. And so what's great about a digital concordance is you can just do it in an instant. So, for example, no matter what translation I'm activating, here in Logos, you hold your cursor over any English word, and you can see in the bottom, like, chicken scratch and weird code words appearing down there. But it's telling you the Hebrew word that appears underneath that English word. And also, do you see it says Strong's Hebrew number? That's a concordance listing. It's actually a link to the online concordance. What's great is that in a digital concordance, all you have to do is switch on the word, and here's this Hebrew word for thorns is coats, and within a click, you've pulled up every occurrence of coats in the Hebrew Bible. It appears 11 times. And you can, then what you want to do is scan them, all the examples in context, and you will often notice magic happening. So think, in these authors' minds, they have all this memorized. Remember, no Twitter or TV, so their brains are fully functioning.
No judgment.
And from the earliest periods of these texts' beginnings, it's oral literature to be memorized and recited within the community. And so, it will be nearly impossible for any of us to ever recreate that experience of the text, where you can do all this mentally. But they could. And you can see, if that's hard to believe, just look in the history of the Jewish tradition, Jewish education. They do it, and the human brain is capable of it. So we need crutches, and they're called concordances, and they're wonderful. They're really wonderful tools. Another very helpful place to look is multiple places to go online. One is called BibleHub.com, and they have a lot of different tools. It's basically a whole website of free Bible study resources. But one of the tools that they have is a digital Strong's Concordance. And so what you can do is, say, open up to the Strong's Concordance, and if you have something that gives you the Strong's number, the Strong's number is all, 5,624 Hebrew words that it has entries for, and that you can do that way. What you can also do is enter in Genesis 1:1 in the search bar, and it gives you what's called an interlinear. So it gives you, here's Genesis 1:1. It's written right to left in Hebrew. And so they give you, underneath each Hebrew word, a corresponding English translation. In the beginning, created God the heavens and the earth. They give you the transliteration of it into English letters, so that you can even begin to sound out the Hebrew words. And then they also give you a clickable Strong's Exhaustive Concordance number. So the first word of the Bible is Reshit. You click on it, and boom, you're in. You've got the list of Reshit occurrences in front of you. So it's free. It's a digital concordance that can get you doing Hebrew word searches. And they have little tutorials on how to use it, but it's a very helpful tool. So everything we're going to do is essentially, I've just done the concordance searching for us that will enable us to start noticing and seeing connections. Thoughts or questions about concordance tools before we close the session?
What's kind of your opinion on people who don't go to seminary, as far, like, how important do you think it is for people to learn Hebrew? Like, because using the tools is one thing, but like a lay person who doesn't go to seminary, learning Hebrew and Greek.
Yep. Yeah. I don't think that most people should do it.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. It's a certain temperament and skill set and brain shape. That, the language parts of our brain are all different and they work differently. And then secondly, it seems to me, right, from the first generation, the apostles had this thing called the body of Christ in mind. And there are nerds in the body of Christ who need to do the work on behalf of others and then share it. And I think that, there you go.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that is. However, I do think for someone who wants to take their Bible reading to the next level, getting the tools and getting familiar with how things work is something that is in the hands of anybody who's interested and driven. And that's why we're doing this. It's why seminaries exist. It's why churches that place a value on equipping people to read their own Bibles wisely, are doing this kind of thing. But for the language stuff, I don't know. I think it's awesome, and I feel greatly privileged that I got to do it. Mackenzie, you got to do it. But it's unique. It's not a replicable model. It's thousands and thousands of dollars and years of your life, and that's just not in the cards for most people. You could talk about your own experience.
Yeah, I do think that, I have a master's. Tim went on and got a PhD, and I think just in general, I constantly try to remind myself that I know just enough Hebrew to make me dangerous at times. So I try to still maintain a sense of humility of sure, I can read it, and but I still need a lot of tools in order to be able to translate it and to translate it properly. So I think just any level of knowledge you acquire, to just remind yourself to be careful, because it is challenging, and it's the Word of God, and so it's fun, and I'm very thankful for my experience. But it's definitely something I think I'm trying to remain humble about what little knowledge I have, and then just being able to share it with others, though. But that's what got me more excited about reading the Hebrew Bible, was being able to read it, and kind of opens up this whole other world to you.
Well, thank you for that. And what I hope to show in the sessions that remain is that you can do an enormous amount with a concordance and an English Bible, more than you might have imagined. And that's actually what got me into biblical languages, was what we're talking about was introduced to me early enough where I reached the point with English when I was like, I'm ready for next level. And I was single and young and had lots of time to spare. I don't anymore, but I did, and there you go. So you can do more with English Bible and a concordance than you might think, and there you go. That's what we're going to do for the rest of the sessions of this class. So let's take a break, and then we'll transition into design patterns and repeated words in Hebrew narrative.